We want to talk to you about a phenomena that's happening in Marin County and Point Reyes National Park. There's a group of ranchers that are kind of getting pushed out as a result of a settlement. And you represent some of the workers that live there and work in these ranches.
That's right.
Tell us what's happening there.
So it's kind of a long saga that goes back to when the national park was first established in 1960. 62. At that time, the ranchers were already there and had been for 100 years ranching, both beef ranches and dairy ranches. And then later, in the 60s, the federal government took the fee title, condemned the park, but the ranchers kept their land. All the land around them was owned by the federal government, but the ranchers owned their land. And they kept on going, farming like they had before. In the 70s, the federal government wanted to buy their land, but they didn't have enough money. So they raised enough money to buy the land, but then give the ranchers back long-term leases. And the ranchers continued operating under long-term leases for a long time. And then more recently, in the 70s, the National Park Service thought it would be a good idea to reintroduce the Tule elk to that park. They weren't there anymore, but they had been a long time ago, and they had either been hunted out or left. They brought these elk back. And the elk turns out to be kind of an environmental tipping point for some environmentalists because the elk herd grew so that it was too large to be sustained. The elk started to die because they didn't have enough food and water. And the elk had a fence keeping them in a certain area. And on the other side of the fence was the ranchers. And so that set up a debate, a kind of a ferocious debate between environmentalists and the ranchers, with the environmentalists saying, we got to get rid of those ranchers because these Tule elk are dying. And it was sort of a cows versus elk situation. This went on for a while. And the environmental groups filed a lawsuit in 2016, I think, or around then, to end ranching in Point Reyes. And that lawsuit was settled. And the settlement said the federal government was required to go study the environmental impacts of ranching and through an environmental impact statement, determine what should happen in this area where the ranches exist. And that statement, commissioned by the federal government, which had tens of thousands of comments from environmental groups and everybody, just like any other environmental study, at the end of it, the federal government determined that ranching should continue and that they should issue new 20-year leases to the ranchers. That was published in 2021. So at that time, the ranchers were going to finally get their long-term leases that had been withheld from them because of these environmental lawsuits. But then the environmental groups sued again, 3 of them. And this time around, even though the federal government had done a study which showed ranching should continue and was the best use for the property, even though that had happened, and even though the federal government could have defeated the lawsuits filed by the environmentalists had they tried to.
So the environmentalists sued the federal government again.
Yes, and the ranchers intervened in the lawsuit. The environmentalists weren't happy with the results, so they sued to prevent it from being implemented. Now, at that point, the federal government has a choice, just like it always does. And you know, they have more lawyers than anybody. They can fight anybody. Fighting the federal government is very, very tough. If they had wanted to, they could have fought the environmental groups and they would have won because they had done a very careful environmental study that supported their decision to restore ranching. But they didn't do that. Instead of doing that, secretly, they sided up with the environmental groups that sued against the ranchers and brought in another environmental organization called the Nature Conservancy. And then over a 3-year period of time, with the ranchers under substantial pressure, they raised money from the Nature Conservancy to buy the ranchers' leases out. Now, those ranchers are leaving, and they voluntarily agreed to leave. I don't know any of the details of those settlement agreements because they're secret, so they're not been published. But I know many of these ranchers. They didn't want to leave, and had they had a real option to stay, with the National Park Service sort of being a true partner, they would have stayed. But their experience had been such that they felt like this was going to be ongoing litigation, one after another, by environmental groups. And there was enough money being offered where those families decided they should take the money and leave. And those decisions were made. I wasn't involved in that process. I didn't represent those parties, although I know most of the ranchers personally. I got involved because those parties had a secret settlement and they forgot to consider My clients, and those are the people who live on the ranches. So there are people who live there who work there. There are people who live there whose parents or grandparents work there. I represent 60 such people, 40 of them are children. There are at least double that. There's some estimates of maybe 150 people who live on these ranches that are about to be evicted because of this settlement. And when I found out that was going to happen, I got involved to represent those people, those underrepresented people. These are not wealthy people, they're working people, to try to protect their homes. And at first, I intervened on their behalf in the lawsuit that had been filed by the environmental groups where this secret negotiation was going on. And I went to one of these, I was invited to the table to try to help negotiate a resolution that included my clients. But the National Park Service was adamant they would never let people stay in their houses. That wasn't an option. The only thing they were ever willing to do was to pay some money so that my clients and others would leave. I didn't think that was acceptable. And even though I'm against the ranching ending, and we could talk about that because it's very bad for Marin County, it's a devastating impact to lose this agriculture in this small community. I was really just focused on housing because there's a housing shortage, of course, all across California, and in particular in West Marin, there's no housing. So if these people get evicted, they don't have any place to go. They'll have to leave the county. So they'll lose their homes and their jobs because the farms are closing, and they'll have to move to another location. And so we are now suing the federal government and the Nature Conservancy. And in our lawsuit, we allege that they conspired to break several laws and at the expense of our clients, and that our clients should be allowed to stay.
Before we get into how the parties work together behind the scenes, you mentioned secretly that they were working together. Can you tell us what's the settlement?
We hadn't filed our lawsuit because our lawsuit gives our clients potentially other remedies. But under the settlement, the ranchers forfeiting their leases and moving, and they have to do that by October 2026. In order to make that deadline, though, they need to close their ranches this year, especially the dairies, because in addition to leaving, they have obligations, as I understand it, to do certain things on their ranches that the national park wants done, like maybe remove a barn or take down a structure or remove all the milking equipment, or maybe there's a pond that they use to catch runoff from the barn. I don't know, because this part of the settlement is secret. It's not been shown to the public. But there are a series of agreements on a ranch by ranch basis where the ranchers have to accomplish a list of things, and then they have to leave and forfeit their lease and agree that they can never ranch again in that location. In exchange for that, they're getting paid money. I don't know how much money. It's secret. But I do know the money is coming from the Nature Conservancy.